For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.
Let's discuss, I guess, kind of what we were touching on in the chat in terms of net gain versus net loss,
right,
and mutation accumulation. I know you had your specific example of a beneficial mutation that you wanted to touch on as well. So
well, I should make a correction. Actually, I've looked at the actual paper, and as far as I can tell, that the current fitness effects of it are unknown. So that I will say.
Okay. Can you put the paper in the private chat maybe?
Yeah, let me see where I can find it.
Or you could just send it after. I definitely like to look at it.
Okay. Yeah,
it does say fitness effects are unknown now?
Yeah, near the end of the paper.
Could you just quickly summarize like what the mutation is?
Yeah. Yeah, most of the information I actually got from a summary of it, given to me by a professor via email. So basically, it was, so you have this pleiotropic enhancer for this gene called SCOOT. And SCOOT controls the arrangement of bristles along the adult fruit fly. And in one species of fruit fly, you have a substitution. And it caused an increase in the number of bristles on the genitalia kind of region. I'm not a fruit fly anatomy expert, but so a decrease on the genitalia and increase in the bristles on the forelimbs. And so the topic of this question is basically, is this a net loss of information? And if so, what specific component kind of contributes to that net loss, basically?
See, to me, this just sounds like a quantitative difference, like how tall someone is, almost. Because it seems the information is the same, it's just a change in the quantities.
So, okay, so from what I gathered there, you said a gene called SCOOT that controls the arrangement of bristles on the fruit fly. And in one specific species of the fruit fly, a substitution, you said, was observed that increased the number of bristles. But then you pointed out that there was a decrease in the number of bristles in one part of the anatomy of the fruit fly, while you also had the increase in another part of the anatomy. Is that correct?
Right, yeah. So I guess my logic in this question is basically, if you're going to say one part, according to your model, if you're going to say one part is a loss, or one part contributes to the loss, basically, then the other part, by necessity, must be a gain, by definition.
Right. So what I would say is this. In terms of the genetic entropy thesis and population geneticists, even the population geneticists that aren't young earth creationists that have acknowledged this problem, they understand that populations of organisms, okay, can be undergoing genetic decline due to the huge numbers of low impact deleterious mutations that are accumulating from generation to generation. But they do acknowledge that you can have a handful of high impact beneficial mutations. Okay, so what that results in, though, is a genome that's degenerating in so many ways, while you may be having a localized adaptive event. But the point is, those localized adaptive events, which this example in the fruit fly seems to be is not actually going to address the bigger picture of net gain versus net loss, because it's not necessarily net gain versus net loss on this specific example. It's as a whole, population-wide, the mutations that are accumulating in the population. So that one single high impact beneficial, yes, will be amplified by natural selection. Whether the beneficial mutation itself is reductive or non-reductive doesn't address the key issue, which is the fact that so many low impact, nearly neutral mutations that are essentially deleterious are accumulating in other places within the genome. I'll say this as an analogy and then I'll yield. It's kind of like your car, okay, where you can fine tune your car. Let's say you had a 10-year-old car, and within those 10 years, you brought it for regular tune-ups, servicing, change the tires. Well, those localized fine-tuning events are not going to actually stop the car from degenerating eventually. As in, after 10 years, no matter how many tune-ups you have done, how many times you've changed the tires or the windshield wipers, your car is still eventually going to rust out. So the best way I could describe your example of a beneficial mutation with these bristles would be analogous to the car and me changing the tires, or my windshield wipers are just not working effectively anymore, so I replace them with new ones. Sure, I had a localized gain of some kind, a localized fine-tuning event, but it didn't address the key issue, is the point. Go ahead, Andrew. What are your thoughts?
So I guess my first question would be, perhaps we need to make a slight, because in my mind there's a slight distinction between fitness effects and information content, at least in a broad sense. So it seems to me, at least, that information content, where it's a net loss or gain, is kind of irrespective of what effects that has on the fitness of the organism, if that makes sense.
Okay, now I want to clarify though. In terms of fitness, that's where we get the idea that most things are slightly harmful, slightly slightly bad mutations, and nothing's truly neutral. If you're just talking about information, then you can have neutral mutations. That's no longer a problem. So say you have like a house blueprint, right? And the chimney is, say, 3 feet long. If we change something on the blueprint to make that chimney 4 feet long, the information has basically gone through a neutral change. And that's okay. There will be an effect on fitness there that's not neutral, but the information really hasn't changed much at all. And from a quantity of information perspective, it stayed the same.
Right. Yeah. I guess. Yeah. I feel like I would agree with that. Like, in terms of, for instance, this example, like I said, I couldn't find any negative or positive fitness effects of this mutation. Presumably. Sorry, go ahead.
Just finish, don't worry.
So I guess I would just say that perhaps the question, so if, because the claim often made is that mutations, or maybe not by you guys, but like some creationists out there I do hear saying that either mutations don't lead to new information, or they're always a decrease in information. And I don't know how that applies here, and that's kind of more the question that I'm asking. So in terms of fitness effects, I'd be inclined to agree, but in terms of the information content,
well, here's the thing.
I don't think you just stick the or statement in those, because those are two very different statements. Saying that mutations always lead to a reduction in information, we don't say that. We say that that they could be. It's very easy to find a mutation that's neutral from a quantity of information perspective. So they don't always lead to a reduction, right? We would just say that your example is not changing the amount of information because it's not.
Right. For example, I'll say this. In these papers that have been published, and these thousands of numerical simulations that have been done using Mendel's accountant, which truly is this massive computer program that is probably the most sophisticated evolutionary modeling system ever written. Okay, because you can take any parameter you want. You can take any mutation you want. You can take any mutation distribution, mutation rate. You can add in whatever population size you want. And when you run its course, okay, the outcome is pretty well always inevitable in the fact that it is genetic degeneration. And Dr. Sanford, he spoke at NIH, okay, and he has studied this problem, especially the problem of human genetic degeneration, probably more than anybody. And he acknowledges the fact, like most population geneticists, that you can have high impact beneficial mutations. And currently, the literature is telling us that beneficial mutations, we were discussing this in the live chat, Andrew, are about 1 in a million. So what they point out is the fact that the beneficial mutation, that 1 in a million, for the most part, they're usually reductive. Sickle cell anemia, okay, has a nice advantage, but essentially it's due to a broken protein, broken cell. And there's an advantage to be had, but it's a degenerative advantage. But they also point out that, yeah, you can probably have some truly beneficial examples that may not be reductive. And they account for all of those. They actually give evolution the beneficial of the doubt, and they have set parameters that are actually kind of unrealistic because we don't see it, but they have added in quite a few super beneficial mutations, and still all you ever get are these localized increases in fitness, but it's total functionality that decreases every time, especially over time. And that's what we find in these numerical simulations. And I'm not going to screen share because I did last time, but there are several papers documenting these as well that they're pretty technical. You know, if you haven't read them, that's fine, but I would definitely recommend it. And I'll say this, and then I'll yield, is a paper that I frequently cite from 2007, The Distribution of Fitness Effects of New Mutations. I just pulled it up in front of me, and they point out, these are evolutionary population geneticists, they point out that it seems unlikely that any mutation is truly neutral in the sense that it has no effect on fitness. Because remember, if you're defining fitness in terms of reproductive success, well, there are a ton of detrimental mutations that can be generated from generation to generation where the species or the organism can still have kids. Especially in the human population, we take care of each other. So I could be born with one leg, or I could be born with a third arm. I don't know, but I can still have kids and pass on those genes. So that's why oftentimes just looking to reproductive fitness is not going to work. You need to look at total functionality, I guess. I would yield. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, I have another point to make there from more of the information perspective, where if we just, you know, the game Flappy Bird, right?
Yeah, I think
so.
So
we sort of try to like dumb down the example here. You know how it's like you get to 10, you get 1 point per pipe, and then at 10 you get a medal, and then at 20 I think you get another one, something like that. I think with your example, it's like instead of getting 1 point per jump, you're getting 2, so you like change that. And then let's say instead of getting the medals at 10 and 20, you get them at 30 and 50, right? So in this example, you've changed some of the values around, like the quantity of bristles in different locations. But the number of bits of information in the program has remained the same. So from an information perspective, the amount of information is the same. And
right.
that would just be the answer to your question, I think.
Okay. Well, I guess something to respond to what SFT said. So you mentioned these simulations. I I think a good question to ask would be, and you mentioned reproductive success, for instance. So are these simulations based on relative fitness or absolute fitness, if that makes sense?
You're muted, SFT.
Muted.
My bad. Yeah, I would say that they account for both, as in you're going to see relative fitness increases or decreases. And at the same time, you're going to see whether or not there's a total decrease in absolute fitness or total functionality. And it's these population geneticists throughout these massive numbers of papers over the years that have documented and understood what an effectively neutral mutation is, which is a slightly deleterious mutation. And that's the point. It's those that are the most harmful. We can have natural selection amplifying your best beneficial mutations. Now, most of them are reductive, but once again, some of them may not be reductive at all. For example, this example seems to be, well, I mean, you've got a gain of bristles in one area and a loss of bristles in the other. So I don't see it helping at all. It's not very impressive to me personally. But the fact is, it's those low impact mutations that all these population geneticists point to as the biggest problem, because it's those ones that accumulate and still allow us to pass on our genes and have kids, because they're deleterious, but they're not deleterious enough where we still can't have kids. That's why every single human being on this planet is multiply mutant, which means natural selection can't rid the population of all the mutants, or else that would rid the entire population of humans, and then we'd be extinct, of course, right? So even if you got rid of the worst mutants, you're still left with mutants that are more mutant than the generation before it. So yeah, these localized events, they are looked at and accounted for in these numerical experiments and simulations, and they have added in parameters where you've got these super beneficial mutations that aren't reductive. Just for sake of argument, let's throw them in there. And still total functionality always decreases and things get worse. Things go downhill. Go ahead, Ayul.
So I guess my thoughts on this are that if a mutation is slightly deleterious, at least in my mind, it seems to me that the fact that you have kids, for instance, isn't necessarily what matters. It's kind of about adaptation, for instance, and like it seems to me that if you have even a slightly deleterious mutation, that's still going to affect the amount of offspring you can have, even in the slightest degree, and that means that the next generation is necessarily going to be slightly less and less viable offspring. And to me, at least, that seems like this slightly deleterious mutation isn't going to be fixed in the population. So it may stick around, but it's not going to spread rapidly.
I think you're still not getting the point. It's not like, oh, we have this big population and one part of the population, like one person gets this mutation, and then a few generations later, oh, their lineage died off because it was deleterious, and now we're good. No, it's like literally every single person that's getting born has a bad mutation.
Right. We are all
so if you want to say, oh, they're all slightly worse off, so they're getting selected out, you're literally just eliminating the entire population at that point.
Right. It's like this. Okay. And actually, I want to point this out here. So here's a couple. So John's back. So this is good. Crow's concern. Okay. The high spontaneous mutation rate, is it a health risk? The typical mutation is very mild. It's exactly what we're saying. It usually has no overt effect, but shows up as a small decrease in viability or fertility. For the past few centuries, harmful mutations have been accumulating. The decrease in viability from mutation accumulation is some 1 to 2% per generation. Okay. And we can go on all day in terms of quotes from these population geneticists. For example, Kondrashov talks about very slightly deleterious mutations is like a ticking time bomb. So what Godzilla Freak pointed out, Andrew, it's the fact that the entire population is multiply mutant. We're all mutant than the generation before it. So that being said, you can get rid, let's say we got 7 billion people on the planet, okay? Fine. Get rid of the worst mutants. The worst mutant. Remember, everybody's multiply mutant, but let's just say the percentage of people that's just a little bit more mutant, okay? Get rid of them. Let's say half of the population, 4 billion roughly. Well, it doesn't solve anything because we're all multiply mutant. We've still accumulated 100 new mutations per person per generation. We have 100 more mutations than we did the generation before it. So now all we're left with is roughly 4 billion people who are more mutant than the generation before it. So the point is, and these thousands of numerical simulation experiments actually verify this, what we get is a selection process that may be able to slow down the degeneration process, but it can't stop. It's inevitable. No matter what parameters we set, even unrealistic parameters like all of these super beneficial mutations popping up that natural selection is amplifying, when in fact the truth is, when we look at nature, even most of your beneficial mutations are not amplified because of all the genetic and environmental noise going on. Okay, it's kind of like static on a TV. It's hard to pinpoint one little piece of static, and that's kind of going on with natural selection in terms of our genetics, because selection acts on the phenotype, not on the genotype. It's either every single nucleotide or none at all. Okay, so a lot of these beneficial mutations actually turn out to be lost and not amplified. But even with the best parameters where we say, okay, let's amplify a few, it still doesn't work. Still doesn't work. So that's the point, Andrew, is everybody's multiply mutant and natural selection can only slow it down. And even the examples you're showing, the example you're showing with the bristles, they're accounted for. As in, okay, for sake of argument, let's just say this was non-reductive. Let's even say it was a super beneficial mutation, which it sounds like it wasn't, because it sounds like there's kind of a net effect. You lose some in one area, you gain some in another. Okay, we're even kind of thing. But let's just say, for sake of argument, it was a super beneficial mutation. Still doesn't work. These localized adaptive events don't help with the decrease in total functionality. Go ahead.
Well, I'd just like to add here, there's an important point to be made that there is a cost for natural selection. Natural selection doesn't freely get rid of bad mutations. The way natural selection gets rid of these mutations is that's to kill off the organism and its lineage, which means that if a sufficient percentage of the population is going downhill, you can't kill them all off. Otherwise, your population will shrink, right? If the amount in the population, the next generation, that have harmful mutations is greater than the amount of like population increase per generation, then selecting them off will diminish your population. So you can't do that anymore because selection has that cost associated with it.
Listen, Godzilla. Evolution is socialism, and I'm sorry, but things can come for free.
Why didn't I think of that?
Okay, why don't we give Andrew, because we both kind of threw around a lot of points there. Why don't we, I'll mute myself, and why don't you just kind of take your time, gather your thoughts, and let us know what you think in terms of the points we've made.
Right. So I guess a question I might ask would be, so
I guess I can't mute because then you go full robotic. So
I forgot about that.
Let me change that up. I won't mute, but I won't interrupt. Go ahead.
So I guess so you guys are saying that not all mutations are harmful.
Is that a question?
Sorry, I got distracted for a second. So not all mutations are a net loss. so it seems to me, I can kind of get what you're saying about these specific lineages, and how most of the population is still kind of degenerating. But I feel like even then there's going to be variation, for instance, in the amount of I think I was talking about this earlier, the amount of badness, basically. And that means you're going to reach kind of a fluctuation around kind of an equilibrium point. And I feel like this argument has been put forward, but I still think that if there's differences in how the effects of the mutations and how kind of deleterious they are, then those mutations are still going to be affected by selection.
Okay, no, like they are getting affected by selection, but selection is actively going to take out the population if you select out the worst. So basically, you get to the point where it's like, if you select out the slightly bad and the really bad, your population is just going to go extinct. If you only select out the really bad, then the slightly bad is going to build up over time.
Well, I mean, like, variation is kind of a bell curve, basically. So it seems like it would stay around the middle.
You know, the problem is the bell curve isn't at the middle. The bell curve is slightly shifted towards the deleterious side. And that bell curve is moving more deleterious over time, right? So eventually you're getting to the point where the fitness is at a really low level because the bell curve is going to keep moving.
And what we're going to find is extinction before we find any real equilibrium. Alexei Kondrashov, The Crumbling Genome. In the average human genotype, over 100 genes are dysfunctional or altogether missing, and over 1,000 genes are substantially impaired. So I think I heard Andrew say earlier that we don't have the evidence today for genetic degeneration, when we do, actually. And these population geneticists are acknowledging it. He also points out a newborn human carries about 100 new de novo mutations originated in the germline of their parents, about 10% of which are substantially deleterious. So what's funny is Alexei Kondrashov is acknowledging this. He's saying 10% because he holds to a genome of functionality of about 10%, when in fact we know it's more like 60, 70, 80%. So what's funny is Alexei Kondrashov, a population geneticist, is acknowledging that this is a huge problem, even when we assume the only 10% of the genome is functional. Now we know about 60 to 80% functional. Whoa, I mean, that means evolution did not happen. And right here is the some data on the super beneficial mutations and the numerical simulations. And it says, in terms of numerical scores within a simulation experiment, just a few extremely beneficial mutations can more than compensate for large numbers of low impact deleterious mutations, right? That's the argument. But this leads to increasing fitness only in a narrow and artificial sense. In the broader sense, the whole genome is still degenerating, because while a few nucleotide sites are being improved, huge numbers are being degraded. This type of trade-off is not sustainable, as it results in a shrinking functional genome size. We actually have verified this in the long-term Lenski experiment, where we have seen just this. Many, many localized adaptive events. But after years and years of running this experiment, what we have is Lenski's 12 bacterial populations. They've all shrank in functional genome size. So overall, in terms of absolute fitness and total functionality, we have shrinking functional genome sizes and a decrease overall. A decrease is what we see in terms of the bigger picture. I yield.
So it seems to me. Oh,
I'll unmute. Go ahead.
So it seems to me that like, as far as I could tell from like Google Scholar and trying to research this for myself, the only resources I could find on this were in small scale experiments, and even then, I have found now Dr. Dan has gone over this, and I know you don't like him, but many of the experiments that have been done are kind of iffy, and as far as I can tell, and as far as I've researched, it doesn't seem like there are very many examples of error catastrophe in nature.
Well, I mean, okay, I could share screen on about like 12 different examples, but I'm at least going to share of actual populations that went extinct due to mutational meltdown. John, share my screen one more time. I want to show an example of today, as in genetic degeneration today in the human population, as in terms of what population geneticists are saying. So right here, Michael Lynch, another world famous population geneticist, he is pointing out in the United States, the incidences of a variety of afflictions, including autism, male infertility, asthma, immune system disorders, diabetes, already exhibit increases exceeding the expected rate. He also goes into rates of autism, people being diagnosed with some type of autism in the autism spectrum disorder, and points out the long-term consequences of such effects is an expected genetic deterioration in the baseline human condition. So population geneticists are actually recognizing this today as a real problem, as we're seeing it in humans. We're seeing the rise of thousands and thousands of these new genetic related diseases, and I'll yield here, many of them being epigenetic and environmental. For example, autism probably has an epigenetic component as well. And the argument from Dodgeball Dan in terms of the fact that he doesn't like the results of Mendel's accountant. Well, you can add in whatever parameter you want, and it is recognized as one of the most sophisticated evolutionary programs in terms of simulating the mechanisms, natural selection, mutations, and so on and so forth. So thousands of simulations have been done, and they all verify and corroborate exactly what these evolutionary population geneticists are saying. So this puts real shelf lives on genomes, and it is a major problem for large-scale evolution. I yield.
I'd like to add that in the case of pointing to specifically error catastrophe, it's sort of like, looking for the wrong thing. Like if I asked you, oh, with evolution, have we observed like a wing forming on an organism? You would say no, right? Not in one step, because it takes much longer than that. Well, genetic entropy is the same way. You're not going to have immediate error catastrophe, right? Because it takes more than how many generations have we sequenced for large mammals? Like basically none. It's going to take longer than what we've seen so far to have error catastrophe. Right, so you're sort of just looking for the wrong thing.
Right, well, I would say, for instance, that there are smaller mammals and organisms, like not necessarily just bacteria or anything like that, but like larger organisms than that, and they're not obviously going extinct.
But like, how many generations have we looked at?
Well, like we know they've been through hundreds, thousands of generations because they're documented probably in historical documents from the Greeks, probably.
Well, see, then that's a different problem, because with error catastrophe, they're specifically talking about like sequencing it and showing that the mutations cause the decline. Right. In the case of just the species way back in time, we don't know what the initial fitness was.
Right.
And right here is a paper that I'd recommend, Andrew, that shows mutation rates are similar for all mammals when based on mutation rate per year. This means that mammals, both even mice and men, should degenerate similarly in the same amount of time. This suggests that the major mutation mechanisms are not tightly correlated to cell divisions. And there are many localized examples of genetic degeneration in tropical crops. We've seen it in hominid populations, which best probably explains the extinction of Naledi, Erectus, Neanderthalensis, Floresiensis. H1N1 virus is showing H1N1 virus, the human version, went extinct due to genetic entropy. Isolated butterfly populations. Here's a paper right here, demonstrates a high genetic load. So these localized events, especially in terms of inbreeding, it's a sneak preview into where we are going as a larger population genetically, right? It's going to take longer for us as compared to a small localized population that is experiencing inbreeding, where there is faster mutation accumulation and accelerated genetic degeneration. But since we are all multiply mutant, well, it is inevitable that we also degenerate, and we're seeing it. I showed you paper upon paper where we have the increase in all of these genetic related diseases and epigenetic related diseases as well. How do you explain that, Andrew?
Yeah, and I think there's something very important with what SFT just showed in one of his earlier slides, and that's that the mutation rate is similar per year rather than per generation for mammals, because for the mammals that have faster generation times, they're generally accumulating less mutations per generation, such that if we're looking at something like mice, which reproduces faster, that's not actually going to mutate faster from a time perspective because of what he just showed, that the mutations are similar per year.
Right. Well, I think, like, for instance, in the human example, and this is probably the last thing I'm going to say before I will have to head out, and I think someone backstage wants in, is the fact that humans, I don't know if it's clear that humans are subject to natural selection, at least not in the same way as natural populations.
Right. Oh, yeah. Keep going, Andrew. No problem. Keep going.
And so it seems to me, at least, that, okay, perhaps we can isolate these specific examples in humans, perhaps the entire human species, or perhaps other species of viruses, bacteria, or things like that. But I don't know if such a thing has been documented, like in natural populations that are subject to natural selection. So I guess that would be my final point.
Well, no, you have to realize, though, the reason we're looking at humans is not because we're trying to, like, cherry pick or something. It's just because humans is what we have historical data for, because that's what we study the most.
And we're studying the human genome so extensively, where we can document all of these diseases. And I will say this, even with relaxed selection, right, the fact that humans take care of the sick, there is a type of relaxed selection for sure as compared to in nature. That just means that humans will degenerate faster than animal populations that are not necessarily experiencing relaxed selection. And numerical simulations document this as well, in that even in mammal populations and setting all these different parameters, you're still going to have genetic degeneration. Now, that being said, humans also kill each other. There's a lot of wars. There's been a lot of wars in the past, of course. So, there could be a counterbalance there to the relaxed selection. But regardless, your best case scenario for the evolutionists just means humans will degenerate and accumulate diseases faster than animals in the wild. But animals in the wild will still eventually degenerate. It just all means we're going downhill. That's it. We're all going downhill from a perfect starting point. Okay, you can take these mutations that have been accumulated back to a point of least mutation accumulation. That would be a point of perfection. That would be a point before the fall. And it's all consistent with the biblical model. And us as biblical creationists have no reason to reject that, because the scientific data corroborates it. I yield.
Okay. Yeah.
My bad. Go ahead, brother. Take your time. I gotta stop muting. I know you got that robot voice when we mute.
Yeah, I don't know why it's going on. Yeah, I would just say, especially that population argument. That's one I hadn't thought about before. So thanks for the versus the specific lineage, for instance. That's a argument I'm gonna have to look into. But everything else I still kind of hold to, of course. So I don't think we're gonna change many opinions right now. But anyways, I do have to head out, and I think Brenda is backstage, I believe.
Yeah, no problem.
It was a good talk.
I want to start saying that more because I feel like a lot of people are getting caught up with, oh, this lineage will get selected out. When the reality is, no, every lineage is going through it at the same time.
Right, exactly. Yeah, everybody's multiply mutant.
Yeah,
that way. But that was a good, respectful discussion, and we enjoy discussing with you, Andrew, because it never turns into a dumpster fire, and I like that.
Well, I try and keep it that way. But all right, well, you guys have a good night, and until next time.
Imagine believing in genetic entropy. There's no evidence for it.
I will.
Will.
Yeah.
Will's an evolutionist now.
Yeah, you let me alone tonight, bro. I became an evolutionist because of that. I've got debunked by the workspace salvationists.
Is there another evolutionist waiting to get in here?
Yeah, I'm here, bro.
Oh, was that you?
Yeah, I'm somebody else. Yeah, Brenda.
Brenda?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, Will's always the one who asks multiple times. Did you see someone asking like 5 times in a row? That's probably Will.
Yeah, let's bring in Brenda. Let's see if she can give us a type of selection that'll remove so many low-impact deleterious mutations that are accumulating from generation to generation. Let's do it.
Oh, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever it is for you.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good night.
Yeah. That's SFT's wake schedule, by the way. Those are the times he's awake.
My schedule has improved lately. I will say that. GS.
So what's the argument?
It's junk science. Don't listen to them.
So the argument is mutations are accumulating far too quickly and in far too many for selection to be able to filter out so many mutations and stop the eventual genetic degeneration of populations over time, Brenda.
Oh, where's the evidence for that?
Here, let me share a screen and show you.
You can just quickly reference it.
Well,
you don't have to go into detail.
I don't think you're. No, I know, but I don't think you're going to believe me unless I show you the quote. So, John, if you could,
genetic entropy has been debunked. That's debunked.
No, it hasn't.
Yeah, it is. It's been. Erica has debunked it.
I can't give you great answers because I don't know them.
John, did you share my screen? Okay, yeah, you did. So we've got population geneticists after population geneticists acknowledging the fact that the typical mutation is very mild. The typical mutation is very subtle to fitness in that it's effectively neutral and it's unselectable. It's invisible to selection. Population geneticists such as Kondrashov considers these very slightly deleterious mutations, and they act like a time bomb in terms of driving populations to extinction. So I could show you 100 different references, but that should be good enough for now. Yeah, how do you deal with that, Brenda?
Well, he's not here anymore, but that just make me laugh. God
Where did Brenda go? Did Brenda run?
Said Erica. Like if they said Dan, that would still be more respectful.
I'm here.
Okay, welcome back.
Well, hold on a second. Didn't Erica even himself said around 100 times that she's not a geneticist and she doesn't have a clue about what she's talking about?
But I'm also not a geneticist and that's not really my world. Yeah, I'll be the first one to admit that I'm not a geneticist. Again, I'm not a geneticist. Genetics is not my forefront. Because I'm not a geneticist. Again, not a geneticist. Then I'm not a geneticist. So I'm not a biochemist. I'm not a geneticist. And I'm not very well versed in genetics. fine, because I got my notes right here, because I don't know enough about genetics.
Again, I cannot emphasize enough how this is not my field. As I've continued to kind of begrudgingly admit throughout the course of this conversation that genetics really isn't kind of my field. I can talk to you a lot about, other stuff, but genetics isn't it. I don't know about because this isn't my field. Genetics really isn't kind of my field.
I'm not a geneticist.
That's not my field. I wish I could give you a better answer.
Yeah, that's why she's irrelevant. And
she's
Well,
not a
it's
scientist.
the argument.
Like you guys
It's
say.
the argument that's important, isn't it? Though.
it's the
Well,
argument.
no,
So
but
let's
like
get it
Erica
right.
herself would say that she doesn't really
Yeah,
do
but
genetics.
but she has, but she and others have actually shown, standing for truth, that he is wrong about.
Okay, show me that I'm wrong right now.
No.
What type of selection can you present us with right now today, Brenda, that can remove so many slightly deleterious mutations that population geneticists acknowledge are a problem? Go ahead, take your time.
Well, I don't know that they're a problem.
I just
Because I
showed
don't-
you they're a problem
No,
from like
you-
4 or 5 different sources.
No,
Answer the
you
question,
said
don't dodge.
So the Alexandry Kondrashov
That's
doesn't
right.
say what you say he says.
Okay, let me just
Oh,
share
really?
screen again then.
He says Kondrashov argues that because of the slightly deleterious effect of mutations, the population will tend to be composed of individuals with a small number of mutations because of the recombination effect of the sex on the genotypes. Individuals with fewer and more deleterious mutations will be created. Since there's a major selective disadvantage to individuals with more mutations, these individuals will die out. So he doesn't say what you said he said. He says differently. He says that sexual reproduction will take some of those mutations out.
Right. Okay. So good point. Good point. So what you're doing is looking to Kondrashov's so-called solutions, the solutions that he proposes. He proposes recombination might do it. He also proposes that synergistic epistasis might do it. The fact is, these rescue devices, okay, have all been falsified using numerical simulation experiments, and they're not able to explain away the rapid increase in genetic related diseases. Also, we have linkage groups where recombination cannot act upon, as these deleterious mutations are linked almost forever, apart from some episodes of gene conversion, of course. So therefore, deleterious mutations in those linkage groups that cannot be torn apart through recombination related events will accumulate and degenerate. These rescue devices have all been looked at. They've all been falsified. Recombination and synergistic epistasis, which Kondrashov does propose as mechanisms to solve genetic entropy, have been falsified. So
is the genetic epistasis, is that a standardly understood in the field as being a real thing?
Synergistic epistasis does happen,
Yes.
but when looked at in terms of numerical simulations and in nature, it actually drives populations into faster extinction events, as it's amplifying these mutations because they're having a synergistic effect. So no, synergistic epistasis as proposed by Alexei Kondrashov has been falsified. It doesn't work.
No, that's
Therefore,
not
try
true.
again, Brenda.
That's not true, right? It's only true when there's a mutation accumulation experiment, right?
We have had mutation
In modern times, but not in the distant past, right?
In the distant, unobservable.
In modern times, you would call this a mutation accumulation experiment because, right, people are not being weeded out; they're being kept alive because of medical advances. But in the past, they were not. So there was not accumulation in the past. People died, right?
Well, the thing is, we haven't sequenced the people in the past, so
But
you
the
can't
conditions-
just say that they weren't accumulating.
We have
were we able to survive? Were we able to save people with holes in their hearts in the past?
No. What you're saying
not
is
the
true.
point.
We do have relaxed selection in terms of medical advancements, helping each other.
Yeah.
But there seems to be a counterbalance in terms of how humans kill each other on a grand scale with all the wars in the past. So there seems to be a counterbalance. But even to give that argument
That's not
to the
true either.
evolutionists, What's not true? That we killed billions and billions.
The level of violence and death in modern times is vastly less than it was in the past.
Well, the point is, there's always been war. There's always been conquest.
There's always been war, but it was greater and in greater numbers and greater percentages than today. Today is among the best time in human history.
Right?
Today is among the so there wasn't this accumulation of mutations in the past because war, disease, and famine was much more prevalent and took out many more people. Today, it would be called a mutation accumulation experiment.
Well,
today would be called today would be called a mutation accumulation experiment. But in the past, we didn't have that. In the past, people were weeded out through war, disease, and famine.
Well,
so
right
today,
it's not selective.
Well, I just want to
that is selection.
Hey, listen, we'll go around the room.
So you do realize it's not just humans, right? We're looking at this for other animals as well, which haven't had a dramatic change in the amount of selection, and we're finding similar results.
Well, I don't know. There might be some cherry-picked examples where you have a population of animals that are undergoing a mutation accumulation environment.
I just want to point out a couple things and try and address what Brenda's saying. So today we still have war conquest. We have war conquest famines in the past. Today we have abortion. Roughly 3,000 babies a day are being killed. Okay, so there seems to be a form of trade-off in terms of this relaxed selection. Okay, but even in the past, natural selection, removing the worst, amplifying the best, as we have always.
And so
stated,
the point is that
the problem
those are not at the levels that they were in the past.
Yeah, right. But even in the past, every single individual.
Yes, but they're not at the same levels.
Every single individual still accumulated mutations from their parents, and every single individual still had more mutations than their parents and grandparents and great-great-grandparents.
Yeah, so what?
All throughout history, humans have always been more mutant than the generation before them. And therefore, genetic degeneration has always been a real thing, past, present, and
there's no such thing as genetic degeneration.
I could show you.
There's no such thing.
Oh no, there is.
Evolution doesn't make value judgments. You are making a value judgment and claiming that mutations are bad. Evolution doesn't make value judgments. You are placing a value judgment on a natural process and saying it's bad. Mutations aren't bad.
Mutations lead to disease. One single point mutation can kill a human being. Mutations are not good. Population
the vast majority don't.
That the vast majority of mutations are effectively neutral. That means they are unselectable and they are slightly deleterious. Just like rust on a car, and just like single spelling mistakes in a book.
It's not rust, though. That's a bad analogy.
Fisherman. It's not a bad analogy.
It is a bad analogy because it's not rust. It's not rust.
Because it degenerates the instruction.
That's a value judgment. You're placing a value judgment on a natural process. A car is not an organism. Rust is not evolution.
The human is less of a human with mistakes.
You're begging the question when you say that rust is like genetic mutations. You are begging the question.
Rust isn't a value judgment either, right? Cars are just mechanical systems.
Right, but organisms are not cars.
But the point is that it's less functional, which you can make a value judgment about.
Except that
it has a
mutations.
You're less of a
Mutations are functional.
You're less of a human with mistakes.
No, they don't. You're begging the question.
Brenda, please.
SFT, you're begging the question when you say that mutations degrade.
Because I have sources.
Yes, you are. You're begging the question.
Real-time population geneticists that are admitting
that's a mistake.
Mutations are not absolutely neutral. They must have some effect on genotype, and they are effectively neutral.
I'm saying
fitness, they still will have a subtle effect on fitness that is not good.
SFT, I'm saying that you beg the question when you make a value judgment that mutations are necessarily deleterious.
Well, that's
much
what the
does
scientist
genome
said,
Happy
dude.
error.
They
Yeah, that's what
don't
the
say that.
population
That's
genetics-
begging the
Do you
question.
want me
No, the
to, do you want me
population
to read your
geneticists do
paper?
say that.
You want me to
It's
read your
begging the
paper?
question.
I've
Brenda,
already showed you that.
Brenda, should I read you something here? Because your religion seemed to be offended right now.
I'm not offended.
Well, you
So,
seem
Brenda,
to
how
be.
much-
And I don't have a religion, and I'm
Well,
not
you
offended.
do. You
No,
believe
I
that God
don't.
doesn't
I
exist.
don't have a
have
religion,
faith.
and I'm not
You have
offended.
faith.
I'm simply
Yep.
forcefully emphasizing
magical-
my point
magical matter.
in face of people talking over me like Jungle
Well,
here.
you're the one talking.
Magical
you're over.
matter.
Because
Okay, so we're gonna go
gish
around the
galloping, because SFT is gish galloping.
No, he's
I'm not
presenting
just developing
papers.
because I have already shown you source after source.
You haven't
paper
shown
after paper.
anything because
Here
you
you go,
are
Brenda,
begging the
Brenda.
question.
John, share my screen
You're
again.
trolling,
Share my
Brenda,
screen
you're
again.
trolling.
Brenda must have had her eyes closed. Now,
Well,
Brenda, make sure your eyes are open this time when I show you the sources showing population geneticists admitting that there is a mutation accumulation problem because most mutations are very slightly deleterious. And this is, for example, when you look at Alexei Kondrashov, he's assuming the genome is only 10% functional. Now we have evidence that the genome is 60 to 80% functional. That means we have 80 mutations roughly that are deleterious accumulating from generation to generation, and not 10%. Not 10,
Well,
I should say. How do you deal with that, Brenda?
Are you talking about junk DNA?
Right, the
You
fact
know,
that junk DNA has been overturned.
That talking point has been debunked. That
everything
creationist
has
talking
been
point.
debunked, right, Brenda?
Oh, we're
But
just
you
heading out now,
learned
you
it.
guys. SFT, you got this. Can't.
Never was junk.
Okay, how much of the genome, both non-coding and coding, Brenda, do you think is functional?
Yeah, I don't know hardly anything about genetics. What I do know,
Then how are you saying it's
What-
been debunked, dude? If you don't have a clue what
because
you're talking
because
about. Dude,
I'll explain it to you.
Hold on,
I'll
hold
explain
on,
it. You
hold
asked
on.
me a question. I can
let
explain
Brenda
it.
finish her. Okay, go ahead, Brenda. Take your time.
So the point is I don't know much about genetics, but I can perceive bad arguments based on
you don't
faulty
know.
reason. And when you beg the question, I don't have to listen to anything else.
Is that
Also,
you,
I
Erica?
know that
Is
you
that
have failed to make a valid
Dude.
argument.
You literally,
Okay, so
dude,
Okay, so the PhDs that I have debated will oftentimes say, oh, you know, max 10%, maybe 15% of the genome is functional. When in fact, we have data, especially from the ENCODE project.
Yeah, that's a
that
lie.
has
That's a
revealed-
lie, and you know it's a lie.
What's
You've
a
been
lie?
shown.
What's a lie?
You've been
They made a
shown
false
that
assumption.
junk
Let me make my
DNA.
point.
You've been shown
Junk
that junk
has been
DNA is
overturned,
true.
which makes the mutation accumulation problem even worse. But the evolutionary community needs to maintain genomes of junk in order to turn those neutral mutations, okay, that are effectively neutral. They want those junk areas to absorb them, making them absolutely neutral. But now that we know the genome is between 60 to 80% active, that means that the majority of these mutations accumulating are deleterious and puts shelf lives on genomes, and therefore Brenda cannot have her bacteria-like organism turning into a whale over billions and billions of years, since mutations are destructive.
We have the fossil evidence.
Okay, so now you want to go to the fossil evidence. So genetics refutes you. Now you want to go to the fossil
How
evidence.
does genetics refute? Genetics
you're less
supports
of a
the fossil evidence.
No, actually,
You're less of a
genetics
human.
contradicts the fossil evidence, because
No,
the
it
fossil
doesn't.
evidence is a historical reconstruction, and that historical reconstruction is only as good as the empirical data. And the empirical data tells us that mutations destroy and not create, which puts shelf lives on genomes.
Then how is it possible
The fossil record is false.
So that's a circular argument. So I told you before I look at the arguments, right? That was a circular. You made a circular argument.
Refuted an argument, yeah.
Yeah, but it was circular, and all I have to do is point out that you made a circular argument and it's false, right?
Well, the only one-
Because you're assuming, right, that your unique perception of DNA is true. You say therefore these fossils, which we have thousands and thousands of fossils.
We have billions of fossils.
Yes, and therefore they can't be real because my pet
No, they're
theory
real.
about genetics that no other genetics believe must be
They're
true.
all buried.
That's your argument.
Dude, you're an idiot,
No, the
dude.
fossil
You're-
record is real.
buried by a
But I want
flood.
to point something out. Similarity does not automatically mean relationship. So when you're looking to the fossil record and you're building these historical reconstructions based on anatomy and morphology, we know today that anatomy and morphology can deceive us because there's oftentimes more variation within the same species than between species. Therefore, looking at a fossil, which has no genetics, there's no way for us to absolutely conclude with full confidence that this is the result of homology or the result of convergent evolution.
Yes,
You
but
can't
it's a
declare
reasonable
relationship from a
reasonable
fossil.
inference. It's a reasonable inference to conclude that two animals which look nearly identical, except for maybe a joint here or there, or some slight difference in the fossil evidence. It's a reasonable inference to conclude that they were related.
No, that's your own interpretation.
It's not.
Hold on, dude. That's your own interpretation coming in, and even
Do you think children look like their parents?
Dude.
Do you think children look like their parents?
Can you stop speaking over us?
Do you think children look like their parents?
Can you stop speaking over us? Can you do that? I know you're being a.
Do you
What
think?
we're gonna do? Okay, what we're gonna do is we're gonna let Brenda finish her thoughts here. Then we're gonna hand it over to Will. No more interruptions here. Okay, Brenda, go ahead, finish your thoughts.
So
and we're gonna
do
let Will
you
go.
think that children tend to look like their parents?
Okay, go ahead, Will.
Yes.
There you go. That's all I need.
Okay, go ahead, Will. Your turn.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that you're appealing to the fossil record because she admitted that you don't have a clue about genetic. You're like, Erica, you don't know what you're talking about, then you're appealing to something else since you don't know what SFT is saying. Okay,
So I'm
hold
appealing
on,
to.
dude, shut up.
You were done. You paused.
Dude, I've stopped speaking for like 1 second, okay? I know your religion is being offended right now, but you gotta hold on.
I don't have a religion.
Yeah, you do. Okay, so
No,
you're
I don't.
scientists. Okay,
Stop saying that.
Okay,
dude,
guys,
shut
let's
the f up, please. Holy crap!
listen.
Can you
Okay,
shut up?
listen, both of you. Okay, listen. Let's deal with the arguments. And right now we're going to start fresh. Let's just deal with the arguments. No attacking each other. No jabs. Okay, so let's just hand it to Will. Will, take your time, respond, then we'll hand it back to Brenda. Equal time.
Well, I was just saying that atheists and their religion are always appealing to, scientists, and they say, well, most scientists believe in evolution, but I want to show you that your own scientists say that there's no fossil record, or they appeal to genetic entropy. They even admitted that mutations are accumulating faster than they're being eliminated by selection. So how do you deal with that fact, Brenda? That
Of what you said. Are you done?
Yeah, I was just saying that how do you deal with the fact that mutation, according to your own scientists, that mutation are accumulating faster than they're being eliminated by natural selection?
I just read to you why Kondrashov doesn't think what you say he thinks. And SFT said that was a good point.
Okay, let me deal with that. So Alexei Kondrashov acknowledges the problem of very slightly deleterious mutations, but when you read through his papers, he does propose some possible solutions. And Brenda was right. Recombination is one of them. Synergistic epistasis is another one. Synergistic epistasis has actually been looked at thoroughly and doesn't seem to be the answer that Kondrashov was hoping it would be. Recombination is a huge problem because, as I pointed out, we have these massive blocks of DNA. We have these linkage blocks, which essentially are immune to recombination. There's a problem called Muller's ratchet, where you've got all the good mutations and all the bad mutations, which cannot be separated because of these linkage blocks. So we've got these very slightly deleterious mutations that Kondrashov points to, and we have maybe one or two slightly beneficial mutations in the same linkage block. Recombination can't do anything about those because they are linked. So they still build up, and recombination doesn't solve the problem. So last thing I'll say, Kondrashov's proposed mechanisms of recombination and synergistic epistasis don't work. How do you deal with that, Brenda?
Because what you say largely is untrue. Because this epistasis that you're talking about is a well understood concept in genetics, and you're just saying, you're just trying to dismiss it, and you're just hand waving it away.
Well,
So
I'm
no.
not waving it away
So
because
no.
I'm looking.
Every
Guys, let me
claim
talk.
that they
I don't want to
make
talk over each
is
other.
false.
Okay, I
It's a
have
mistake.
a paper. I have multiple papers in front of me where synergistic epistasis, what it is, okay, because we're throwing that term around. A lot of people might not know what it is. Well, if we have a lot of mutations that are deleterious, which these population geneticists acknowledge, okay, as they accumulate, what synergistic epistasis does is amplifies these mutations, amplifies their deleterious effects. And therefore, the intensity of degeneration becomes so great that selection can now act more efficiently. But this fails because all it does is select out localized populations and drive them to extinction, while it does nothing to solve the bigger problem. Therefore, introducing synergistic epistasis actually makes the problem worse because it just drives localized populations into faster extinction. And this has all been verified through numerical simulations. I'm looking at a paper right now. I'm not going to share screen because we're having a dialogue here, but it doesn't work. It's been falsified. I don't know what to tell you. I'm not lying. I have a paper right here, and I'll send it to you.
So you're claiming that synergistic epistasis has been falsified.
Synergistic epistasis hasn't been falsified in terms that it doesn't happen. It does happen. Mutations amplify each other's effect. There is a synergistic effect.
So it is real. So it is accepted by the community.
Synergistic epistasis happens. It's real. But the mechanism fails to halt deleterious mutation accumulation is my point.
Yeah. How do I know that that's true?
Because I'm looking at a paper right now. Also, there's been thousands of numerical simulations.
By the way,
to demonstrate that.
What is your degree in?
My degree is from Harvard. I actually have 10 degrees. What about yours?
What is your what is your degree in?
No, that's the truth. Yeah, I've got 10 degrees.
I was asking you what your degree is in.
Brenda, what is Eric?
It's irrelevant to the fact that Brenda.
Is it relevant to genetics?
To the fact here that Brenda has not been able to refute me on recombination.
What is your degree in?
Can I say
synergistic epistasis? I just showed that those escape mechanisms do not work to halt deleterious mutation.
Well, you made claims.
Now Brenda is committing a red herring.
Hold on a second.
I'm just curious.
Hold on.
I'm just curious because you're making all these appeals to authority, and you're not an authority.
Brenda, you're being a hypocrite. First of all, you join and say that Erica has debunked SFT. So what is the degree of Erica for debunking someone?
Has she done it?
Well, you said that she debunked SFT. So what is
she? Brenda, you've done a better job than Erica. You at least put forth synergistic epistasis, which I've read up upon extensively, and recombination. Yeah, that's what Alexei.
What was your degree in again, SFT? What's your degree in?
Yeah.
Do you have any STEM degrees?
Yeah,
I have any STEM degrees.
I have 35 PhDs from Harvard University.
You have 35 PhDs.
Hold on.
You have 35 PhDs?
Yeah.
You do not have 35 PhDs.
Brenda.
I have 50 PhDs from Harvard.
No, you don't.
Brenda, answer the question. What question? Is going to halt genetic degeneration now that we know recombination doesn't work and synergistic epistasis?
You just said that. You just said that. You didn't show that.
Evolutionists say things.
You just said that. You didn't show it.
Explain in your own words how synergistic epistasis halts genetic degeneration. Explain to us.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know the content. I told you. Hey, just a minute. I told you that I pay attention to the logical structure of your arguments, and not necessarily to the content. I don't know the content. Period. Yeah. End of story.
Listen to this logic. Every claim of evolution is always debunked because there is no evolution.
Brother JD,
well, that's just a claim that you're making, Jungle, and it's false. No, it's not true, Jungle. That's not. You're just saying things. What's your argument, Jungle? What's your argument?
The argument is they make a claim and it's debunked. They make another claim.
That's not an argument. That's not an argument.
Claim and it's debunked. I've been watching this for 50 years of my life, Brenda.
Yes.
Every claim they ever made is always debunked.
Well, you've had it shown to you that you're wrong multiple times over the years. I've seen you shown to be wrong
It's not
multiple
my claim.
times,
It's not
but you
my
just
claim of
deny.
evolution.
But what is your argument against evolution, Jungle?
Because they make claims. They made the 98% claim. That was debunked. They made the junk DNA claim. That was debunked.
No, it wasn't.
Every claim they ever make is always debunked.
None of that is true. You're not telling the truth.
That is all true.
You saying it's true doesn't make it true. It's easy to discover. It's easy to discover this by simply doing simple searches. I can easily discover genetic entropy is debunked. The idea of 98.1% debunked. Junk DNA claims by creationists debunked.
It's always debunked. Keep believing.
Yes, it is.
Been debunked. So how much
They have been.
do you believe is functional, non-coding and protein coding?
Well, whatever the geneticists say.
Okay, so whatever the geneticists say, you're going to blindly believe.
Yes, I'm not going to blindly. So I don't blind. Jungle, just a second. I don't blindly believe. Jungle, please hold your horses. Standing for Truth says I just blindly believe, and that is false. I don't blindly believe. I take the testimony of experts as being more likely to be true than some internet creationist who thinks the Earth is 10,000 years old.
Their claims that are debunked every time.
JJ, let me respond.
It's not true.
It's their claims that are always debunked every time.
Be quiet. Be quiet. Jungle, you're just saying the same thing over for 5 minutes. You just said the same sentence.
Because every claim they make is always debunked for 50 years of my life.
Saying it over and over for 10 minutes doesn't make it any
Okay, so you're
going
to wait for the next claim and believe the next claim,
you're
and
just
then you'll be
saying
disappointed
things.
again.
You're just saying things.
You'll be
I want to
disappointed
ask,
again.
standing for truth, what is your evidence for a young Earth?
So my evidence for a young Earth, I believe, can start in what we're talking about in terms of mutation accumulation as it puts shelf lives on genomes and at least demonstrates a young genome. So how do you refute the evidence for a young genome? If you want evidence for a young Earth itself, well, then we can look to other lines of evidence. But
that doesn't prove that the Earth is young. That doesn't prove the Earth is young. That doesn't do anything for the Earth. What are you talking about?
It demonstrates that the genomes are young, which falsifies.
Yeah, but who cares?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
So
it doesn't matter.
That humans and chimpanzees are not related, and it demonstrates that apples and whales aren't related. That's
no, it doesn't.
You, not me.
So you haven't demonstrated that the Earth is young.
Everything was buried by the
genome is young.
anyway.
That's enough to show evolution.
But that doesn't show that the Earth is young.
Okay, so you want
irrelevant.
If
the genome is young, it's irrelevant. The age of the Earth is irrelevant. The genome is young.
So Jungle, I'm trying to talk to SFT. So I asked him, just a minute. I asked him for evidence of a young Earth, and he told me that the genomes are young, and that's a non sequitur.
Young Earth is irrelevant.
No,
it's important.
Okay, here. I'm going to respond.
So what is your evidence for a young Earth?
Okay, I'm pointing out. I'm going to give you evidence for a young Earth if you'd like to. Now, I'm pointing out the fact that we can demonstrate a young genome using genetics. Now we can look to another line of evidence to demonstrate that the Earth itself is also young. So if you want to go to that, that's fine. I don't believe.
That's what I'm asking you.
Right, but Brenda, just a sec. I like to deal with each topic one at a time. Now I know you disagree with what I'm about to say, but I don't believe that you have essentially argued sufficiently against genetic entropy. I think your rescue devices that you look to failed, and that's fine. We can move on to another topic. So if you want to look to evidence for a young Earth, I could look to probably 100 different ways. I'll use something easy. For example, radiocarbon. So we know, Brenda, and I'll get your thoughts on this. We know that carbon decays so rapidly to the point that if we were to say every single atom in the universe was made of carbon, it would all decay within probably about 1 million years easily, okay? So here's the problem for the evolutionist, is that we know that radiocarbon exists in all sorts of fossils. Radiocarbon is found in diamonds, coal, fossilized wood, and these items are dated to 100 million years or more, hundreds of millions of years, and they come back with detectable levels of radiocarbon. So that limits the age of the Earth, since carbon is found in fossils dated to hundreds of millions of years. So how do you explain that from an old Earth perspective?
So you recall that I examine the logic of your arguments and not the content. So the argument you just gave is guilty of the equivocation fallacy, because you were equivocating between carbon and its isotopes. Carbon-14 is an isotope of carbon. Carbon itself is not radioactive and doesn't decay. Radioactive carbon does. So your argument that you just gave is fallacious.
Let her finish.
It's fallacious because you committed a logical fallacy of equivocation between carbon and carbon-14.
No. Okay. So if you're done, I'm gonna respond. So we would all agree that radiocarbon influx. Okay. For example, with carbon-14, it's produced in the atmosphere as a result of cosmic ray bombardment, right?
Yes.
Now here's the thing: the carbon-14 should have decayed. It's exactly why evolutionists don't look to carbon dating when dating rocks that they assume are hundreds of millions of years old, because they know there should not be any carbon-14.
Is it continually produced in the atmosphere?
It's continually produced in the atmosphere, but these fossils, diamonds, for example, they are found so deep within the Earth that there should not be any carbon-14 through the cosmic ray bombardment of the atmosphere, because it's buried so deep. Carbon-14 would never get into these fossils in terms of fossilized wood, diamonds, coal, and yet we find very, very high levels of carbon-14, and contamination's been looked at, and these results are repeatable. So how do you address that?
So the point is that carbon-14, the radioactive isotope of carbon, is produced from carbon by bombardment from cosmic rays, and is continually produced, right?
In the atmosphere.
And any animal, particularly mammals, take up, just a minute, take up carbon-14 in their bones, and then when they die, they stop taking it up. And so then we can tell that they are no longer at equilibrium. They're no longer at equilibrium with the environment, and we can use that as a clock to measure how long it's been since that animal died. Diamonds are not animals, so we just don't use it for that, because it's not an appropriate tool to use in that situation, right?
Dinosaur bones.
Why would we use carbon-14 for that?
The point is, you're looking at
it's biological matter.
No, it's not. You don't even know the basics. No, there's no bone left in a fossilized dinosaur bone. No, there's no bone left. It's mineral.
The point is,
no, they don't. It's mineral. It's not. There's no organic material left.
It used to be biological, anyways.
Yeah.
The point is, all of that carbon-14, all of that carbon-14 should have been done away with in hundreds of millions of years. So
when you say that carbon-14, which carbon-14 do you mean?
Well, you have carbon-14, like you pointed out, when the biological organism dies, it's no longer eating plants.
That's why it's limited to about 40,000 years as far as the clock goes. Right. So they use other methods of radiometric dating, don't they?
Right. But you're not getting the point. They use other methods. Well, real quick. They're using other methods of radioisotope dating, for example, potassium to argon, uranium to lead. Okay, we can go through all of them, because they assume the science of carbon-14, okay, and the production of carbon-14 in terms of cosmic ray bombardment in the atmosphere is accurate, and I agree it's accurate, which is why if these fossils if this oil, this coal, fossilized wood, I've got papers on where they've detected carbon-14. They don't use the carbon dating methods because they assume there should be no carbon-14 detectable. The fact is, when we do measure the levels of carbon-14 in these items that are dated to the evolutionists,
I don't see how that's relevant.
Well, it's relevant because there shouldn't be if these. Let's say these dinosaur fossils really were hundreds of millions of years old. There shouldn't be any carbon.
Yeah, they are.
It should be gone because it can only last a few 100,000 years max.
Can samples be contaminated?
Well, contamination's been looked at, and
yes, it's been found. Yeah, well, actually, that would be the inference that you would make, wouldn't it?
Well, no, because they have.
Why not?
Well, because they have, through their samples in radiocarbon laboratories, they've subjected all of these samples before they actually carbon-14 date them to repeated brutal treatments. They use strong acids, and they also use bleaches. They use bleaches to rid them all of contaminations. So by the time they use these instruments to test them, they're testing blank samples. And yet they still yield radiocarbon levels.
Yeah, so I don't know about the particulars of any cherry-picked items that you're going to refer to. Okay. I would just say that you simply wouldn't use that tool for that subject because you use the appropriate tool for the appropriate subject.
Yeah, but that's
right?
circular. You don't even see the.
No, it is. That's not circular.
Yes, it is circular because you're assuming these fossils, you're assuming the diamonds, you're assuming whatever it is being tested are hundreds of millions of years old because of what we know in terms of the science of carbon-14 production.
No, not because of carbon-14.
Test these samples. What do we find? We find C14. It doesn't matter whether it's organic. It doesn't matter whether it's organic or not. The point is there shouldn't be any carbon-14, and yet we find carbon-14 in dinosaur fossils. We find it in coal.
Yeah, it can be contaminated.
I already told you that they have looked at this before they tested samples.
Who's they?
The paper I'm looking at is a PhD geophysicist, and he points out that
with the Creationist Institute.
Well, real quick, I'm trying to answer your first question 3 questions ago. So they have subjected these samples, like I said, to brutal treatments. They've used strong acids and bleaches, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And these samples had been repeatedly tested. So it's not just once or twice. They repeatedly tested them, and they still came up with detectable levels of carbon-14. Shouldn't be there. So that limits the age of the Earth to thousands of years old. That answers the question. But contamination doesn't work. It's been looked at.
Well, also, real quick, George is in the backstage. Can someone let him in?
Sure.
Can you let him in, a safety?
I think it has to be John.
So we have multiple lines showing that the Earth is at least 4.5 billion years old, and the universe itself is 13.5 billion years old.
Okay,
you haven't given me any evidence for a young Earth. No, you didn't. No, you didn't. You have to give me positive evidence, not negative. You have to give me positive.
14.
You have to. That's not positive evidence for a young Earth.
It limits the age of the Earth to thousands of years old.
No, it doesn't.
And it's only one. A single-celled ancestor into a whale in just thousands of years? Of course not.
I'm not talking about evolution. I'm talking about physics here.
Your God, it's like a pacifier. When I remove time, it's like removing a pacifier from a baby's mouth. You start to cry.
So you haven't
to take your fish-to-fisherman. I have given you a line of.
No, you haven't. You didn't give me positive.
The fact that we find C14 in all of these samples that evolutionists
it doesn't.
Are hundreds of millions of years old. They say diamonds are billions of years old, and yet there's detectable levels of C14 that destroys deep time. And now you're trying to run to another argument. Well, we have these other lines of evidence. That's all it takes is one to limit the age of the Earth, and that's it. You're done. I've removed the pacifier.
So you want another evidence of a young Earth?
Yeah, you want another one? Are you going to concede that one? So now we've demonstrated a young genome through mutation accumulation. We've demonstrated a young Earth with the carbon-14 argument. I can look to helium and zircon crystals. Helium is incredibly slippery. Why do we find helium in zircon crystals that evolutionists date to billions of years?
See, these are just whataboutisms. You need to provide positive evidence.
Come on. You wanted evidence.
This isn't evidence.
Evidence for young
It's
Earth.
not evidence. Evidence.
We're giving you, the evidence for young Earth.
You need to provide positive evidence for your claim that the Earth is young. I have positive evidence that the Earth is old.
I'm actually looking at a paper. I'm actually looking at a paper from secularists, okay, where they point to a possible argument in a possible solution in explaining away the C14 in these samples, because they even admit that contamination is not a good solution. And what they say, okay, not young Earth creationists, they say that there's other nuclear material down where, okay, this is specifically to diamonds. They say there is other nuclear material down where diamonds are, deep within the Earth, that can recharge the C14. So that's a better argument than you're looking to. Your argument of contamination is even laughed at by the secular scientists, Brenda. Explain in your own words how synergistic epistasis halts genetic degeneration. Explain to us.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know the content. Period. End of story.